Good evening, everyone, or morning or afternoon, depending on where you are. My name is Alberto Toscano. I co-direct the Center for Philosophy and Critical Thought with Julia Eng and Vicky Bell here at Goldsmiths. I'd like to welcome everybody to the first of our two annual philosophy lectures for 2021, which we're immensely pleased will be delivered by Professor Monique David-Ménard. So this is the third of our annual lectures, following the inaugural one in 2018 by Jean Khalfa and Robert Young on Frantz Fanon's Lost and Last writings, and Christoph Menke's 2019 talk on the critique of law and the law of critique. Indeed, of course, Professor David-Ménard's lecture was meant to be last May. We postponed in the hope that we'd be able to do this in person. But we were not, which is an advantage, of course, to all of you who are far-flung and not in vicinity of New Cross. So you have that to thank for tonight's talk as well. So it is the first of the lectures that will take a kind of plural format. The ones that we had before were just one session. With Professor David-Ménard, we'll have two sessions on different days. Our second session will be on Thursday. And both of our sessions will have separate respondents. So we're very fortunate to have two superlative scholars of psychoanalytic and legal theory, respectively Darian Leader speaking today and Alain Potage on Thursday, to frame a conversation around Professor David-Ménard's profoundly original and challenging work on the object and property at the nexus or the disjunctive synthesis of psychoanalysis, philosophy, anthropology, politics. And on behalf of the Center, I would also like to express our gratitude for co-sponsoring this event to the Center for Freudian Analysis and Research in London. Now, the Center for Philosophy and Critical Thought was constituted as a center open to the rigorous philosophical work also being done in disciplines outside of academic philosophy. And it is in that spirit also that we're very happy to have Professor David-Ménard talking about the subjects as he's talking about today and Thursday. The Center regards philosophy as a plural and critical activity that engages with the arts and practice-based approaches, and which also strives to analyze and articulate historical and political events. In this regard, CPCT is also envisaged as a response to the paradoxical conjuncture in which critical philosophy finds itself today. Widely read across the arts and sciences, called upon to engage in public and political debate, yet sometimes taught in relative isolation from other disciplinary domains. By creating a space for philosophy's dialogue with other disciplines and publics, the Center aims to develop a distinct research profile here for the future of philosophy at Goldsmiths, which inherits the best of a legacy of so-called continental philosophy while affirming a more openly transdisciplinary vocation for philosophical inquiry. In keeping with Goldsmith's long-standing tradition of public and political engagement, CPCT promotes a publicly oriented conception of what it means to do philosophy. So for the above-mentioned reasons, we think that Professor David-Ménard is an ideal choice to deliver our annual lecture. And I will, in a moment, let Julia introduce her and her work. Now, before I do, I wanted to direct those of you who haven't already to register via our website for our six-part annual conference on tragedy and philosophy, which will begin on June 2nd and take place on the 3rd, 4th, 9th, 10th, and 11th. I would also like to let our attendees know, and this is important for this evening's conversation, that after Monique David-Ménard's talk and the response by Darian Leader, we'll be able to open up the session for questions. So if you could please either write a question under the Q&A tab, which either Julia, myself, or Vicky can read out, or make a note that you would like to ask that question in person, so to speak, and we can promote you, as it were, to panelist status, and you can turn on your video and sound on and ask a question directly. So without further ado, then I'll pass on to Julia to introduce Professor David-Ménard.
Right. Thank you very much, Alberto. And welcome also everybody to the third annual Goldsmiths Philosophy Lectures. I'm Julia Ng. I'm a founding co-director of the Center for Philosophy and Critical Thought. And it's my great pleasure and honor to be able to introduce to you our speaker this year, Professor Monique David-Ménard. Monique David-Ménard is Professor Emerita of Philosophy at the University of Paris Diderot, so Paris 7, where she served as the director of the Centre d'études du vivant, under whose auspices she established gender and sexualities as a field of research. Directrice du programme and later vice president of the Collège International de Philosophie from 1992 to 1998, and currently an associate of the Institute for Cultural Inquiry in Berlin, as well as a member of UNESCO's International Network for Women Philosophers. She has also been a practicing psychoanalyst for many years, and is a vice president of the Société de Psychanalyse Freudienne, as well as the co-founder of the International Society for Psychoanalysis and Philosophy. For her numerous contributions to the Academy, she has been awarded the title of Chevalier de l'Ordre des Palmes Académiques, and her work the subject of discussions internationally, including a special issue of Hypatia in 2000 devoted to contemporary French women philosophers, and a colloquium on her work entitled Objects, Phantasms, Life, and Death, held at Columbia University in 2014, that was subsequently published in the journal Philosophia. These institutional and international accolades attest to the distinction Professor David-Ménard's work brings to the convergence of philosophy, psychoanalysis, and feminist philosophy, three fields with which she has had a career-long engagement. After completing a master's degree in philosophy with Paul Ricoeur in 1968, she earned her doctorate in psychopathology and psychoanalysis in 1978, with a thesis supervised by Pierre Fédida. The resulting book, which first appeared in 1983 and then in English translation in 1989 under the title Hysteria from Freud to Lacan, Body and Language in Psychoanalysis, is an illuminating study of how, in both the etiology of hysteria and the psychoanalytic discourse on hysteria, a biological body is not simply invented in language, as it were, in order for the erotogenic body to be fathomable as somehow real, but an instance of a break in the epistemological efficacy of psychosomatic and dualistic theories of said relation between body and language. Not only is this book where David-Ménard first distinguishes between Freud's theory of the objects of the drives and Lacan's interpretation thereof, according to which linguistic symbolization replaces the changeability of the object to affirm the object's lack of any particular importance. David-Ménard also thereby brings clinical intervention to bear on theoretical and philosophical discourse on the being of their objects, such that the clinic becomes available as a laboratory in which philosophical concepts are forged or, as the case may be, tested and their accommodating systems reevaluated. Staging this encounter would be the subject of her second doctorate, this time in philosophy, which she earned under the direction of Jean-Marie Bessade in 1990, and which resulted in the book Madness and Pure Reason, Kant as Reader of Swedenborg, as well as a translation into French of Kant's Observations on the Beautiful and the Sublime, both of which were published in the same year. In this work, David-Ménard argues that while Kant's critical philosophy hails itself as the revolutionary victory of reason's moderation over the fanatical and dogmatic excess of the mind, it nevertheless evinces a proximity to madness that betrays the centrality of mental disorder as well as sexuality in the very construction of the critical system's systematicity. Reading Kant's essay on the maladies of the mind alongside the observations as concerned with how feelings and desires can come to be regulated by principles, as well as an account of Kant's essay to alleviate his own hypochondria through theorization, David-Ménard describes how this concern converts into the formulation Kant would eventually give to the moral law in his mature philosophy, and is retained in the pathological content that the moral law negates as grounds for our actions. David-Ménard not only thereby discloses how the critical philosophy is, at bottom, motivated by pathological content. In paying close and rigorous attention to Kant's early pre-critical writings, she also joins the ranks of the still far too few scholars who have questioned the standard account of the genesis of the transcendental philosophy, and as such also shifted focus from concerns with symbolism and consensus as the sole lens through which to understand Kant's theory of how we relate to the law of our own autonomy, and opened it up to revisioning in light of all those, especially certain sexuated identities, whose desires have been treated as necessarily untheorizable in virtue of the unconditional and the universal. The encounter between psychoanalysis and philosophy returns in many of David-Ménard's subsequent works, of which I'll only mention a few. Constructions of the Universal, published in 1997 and reissued in 2009, for instance, takes up the altercation between Freud and Lacan on the theory of drives first discussed in her book on hysterical conversion, and elaborates from it a rich reflection on the manners in which the theory of the substitutability of objects oriented at repetition rather than destruction can, I quote, provide an opening beyond the rhetoric of the unconditional and put to the test the manner in which it is constructed in Kant's text and beyond. As such, it opens up a place for the clinic as well as for the anthropological underpinnings of the refrain for all of humankind that, as David-Ménard points out, are most productively thought through the resistance to indifferentiation and suppression of the pathological that otherwise transform the experience of being at fault into the relative indifference of our material acts. Deleuze in Psychoanalysis, the book from 2005, stages, through a reading of Difference and Repetition in Capitalism and Schizophrenia, an altercation between Lacanian psychoanalysis and philosophy, culminating in a study of Kant's theory of negation that returns to David-Ménard's earliest concerns with the pre-critical writing's fundamental importance for later elaborations on the relation between negation and reality. David-Ménard's most recent and much anticipated book, The Social Life of Things, on Animism and Its Objects, appeared last year and elaborates on the dual promise of the anthropological and the clinical in a wholly new direction. How, it asks, do objects out of themselves inanimate end up structuring our social relations and conflicts? Extending the discussion to the anthropological works of Marilyn Strathern and the history of and philosophy of property law, The Social Life of Things challenges the manners in which social relations have been rendered transparent by virtue of an abstractive process applied to the theories of law and commodities alike. It is from this book that the lectures today and on Thursday are drawn, and it is our greatest pleasure to be able to hear for the first time Professor David-Ménard discuss her latest project. This being said, please join me in welcoming Professor Monique David-Ménard to Goldsmiths.
Thank you very much, Julianne. I am very honored and pleased to speak today this evening with you. It would be in any case, but now, just when we re-begin something after this pandemic isolation, it's a great chance for me to be with you, even with Zoom today. This evening, it's the clinical side of my work that I will put in a test with you. It's a big problem into psychoanalysis, and especially in the Lacanian psychoanalysis. Should we speak of clinic out of our small circles in our societies or not? I think we must do that. Otherwise, we don't know what psychoanalysis can bring to us. And the clinic is not an illustration. It's more a discussion with previous theories, and I think that psychoanalysis, some friends are said always to me that it's my idea, but it's not true. But I think that psychoanalysis is like experimental science. That is to say, the theory can be tested through the experience of the transference. So I am very pleased too that Darian leader joined Julian and he said that he will discuss with me. Thank you very, very much. So my talk is object of desire, objects of the drive, and jouissance in transference. Psychoanalysis approaches sexual life through a problematic of excess. Excess with regard to any regulation of life, with regard to the mere satisfaction of our pleasure. Excess of transferal repetition with regard to remembering, but also excess of destructiveness in the aim of pleasure itself, was what Freud ultimately called the death drive. But it was already present in his 1895 model as the risk of extinguishing all the tension in the psychic apparatus. When he became an anthropologist of modernity, Freud spoke of civilization and its discontents, in other words, an excess of Triebeleben, of the life of the drive. I don't know exactly how do you translate Triebeleben in English, and it's an interesting question. It's not instinctual life, but I don't know if the life of the drive is very common in English. So, in other words, an excess of Triebeleben with regard to what culture, in any event, the modern culture of the 20th century may offer as a transformation of drives. Let us call unconscious sexuality the series of attempts by which we try to establish the compatibility between, on the one hand, what we dream of and what makes up our singularity, and on the other, the condition of subjective social existence. Where Freud spoke of civilization and its discontent, and of going behind the pleasure principle, Lacan, as you know, prefers the term jouissance, which is both a legal term and one that expresses the idea that pleasure and displeasures exist on a step slope that is incompatible with law and social relations. Since this term is used in several different ways by Lacan himself, as Darian leader demonstrates remarkably well, today I would like to clarify how excess manifests itself in the space opened by an analytic cure. In particular, concerning the object that take shape in unconscious formations through transference, how close are they to the traumas that the sexual drive try to change? This is first a question that is intrinsic to the cure. How the real, in the Lacanian sense, but also how reality are called upon in the process of an analysis. I said, but also how reality, to question the Lacanian distinction, real reality, as we will see. Then, if we manage to clarify that, we will be able to see more clearly how the connection is made between objects of desire and social object, or dispositive or settings. This will then lead us to another question, more epistemological than clinical this time. Do we have a meta-language at our disposal that would allow us to unify the excess of the objects in sexuality and in the social, and unify also the heterogeneity between social exchanges and transmission and the field of transference? This seems to me to be what is at stake in the Lacanian theory of the four discourses, which devotes itself to showing how the relation of mutual exclusion between knowledge and jouissance control discursive formation by attempting to eliminate the excess that nevertheless circulates within social exchanges. When in psychoanalysis, we examine how the sexual desires at work in symptoms, dreams, and transference come into contact with the rules of social, legal, and political relation, a twofold interrelationship takes shape. Depending on the situation, the pre-established social rules and activities either form a hindrance or conversely an outlet for the displacement of objects and drive that receive this reputedly external material. Psychoanalytic theories offer models that are sometimes relevant, yet sometimes obsolete, for the assessment of these interactions. The theory, for example, the theory of killing the father, instituting the respect of the laws through the repression shared by the brothers of the guilt tied to this primal murder, or the theory of jouissance circulating in the structure known as discourses that link the excess of jouissance in various ways to the fields of knowledge that focus on it even as it escapes them. But these theories often inadequately summarize the deadlocks in the process of a cure that the analysants wish to break. If we seek to understand how the structure of desire are created with the help of institution or despite the hindrance they present, the most interesting thing to do is measure the insituability of the classic models to this clinical situation. So, a short clinical case. Alain D. could be placed under the heading obsessive neurosis. Both his working life and his sexual life come up against constant inhibitions and exorcistic rites. He feels like he is barely alive, although he is a recognized university academic who has had a few intimate relationships during which he has anxiously confronted the impotence that inhibits him at the beginning of the relationships, at least. He knows that his research activities have essentially come to a halt as well. He says he is content with a minimum that could eventually compromise his career. In addition, he has always known that his childhood was marked by a double mourning. His maternal grandfather died a few months after he was born, and from then on, his grandmother had told him, I quote, "You are my only reason for living," end of quote. He is so intelligent when speaking of a dream that everything he understands about it is a way for him to distance himself from the very fact that he had the dream as an event. Through his knowledge, he obliterates the dream that disturbed him for a time. The analyst is tempted to wait passively for the violence that is suppressed beneath his consistent politeness to establish a relationship with the presupposed beneath that is suppressed beneath, his consistent politeness to establish a relationship with the supposed violence of his relationship to his father. But nothing of the kind takes place. An event in his love life, and I will say another thing, the problematic of suicide is very, very important in the repetition, and especially his grandfather died when he was born, and when he was 9 years old, the son of the mother committed suicide, and then in his love life, this came again and again. An event in his love life could have turned my attention to a repressed violence that would fit into the classic schema of the relationship to the father, and to obstacle to the desire for the mother. The first dream mentioned during the analysis seemed to portray this guilt. He ran away with a friend after committing a crime. The crime was not specified, but it was accompanied by a supplementary clause. He had stolen some pillows from his parents. He ended up alone in prison, sentenced to die, and writing a last letter to his parents, telling them how much he loved them. Then he woke up. What a wonderful Oedipal dream, one might say, except that the crime was committed against both parents. And in the cure, there is no point in waiting for any manifestation of violence directed slowly at the father and linked to an erotic desire for the mother. What then was that violence that pervaded his dream? As truth is often stranger than fiction, and especially during the years of the cure, when the analysis began, Alain D. met and lived for a time with a young woman whose parents had been murdered. He respected, and that is the important point, he respected her suffering to such an extent that he got to the point where he agreed to stop seeing any of his friends, especially any of his ex-girlfriend from before, even if that meant cutting himself off from nearly everyone who was important to him, in order to keep her from suffering still more, this time from jealousy. During the period when he was coming up against the violence demands of this partner, he spoke often, this time without intellectualization, about the fact that he could not bear the idea of being the cause of someone suffering, even if it only happened once. I quote him, "I take everything she criticizes me for upon myself. Last night I dreamed that I lived at my friend Isabel's house while she wasn't there. Even though there has been nothing between Isabel and me for a long time, I am guilty. The moment Françoise accuses me of anything, I am guilty. I would rather get out of her life." End of quote. So there is guilt, but converted into a retreating masochism that was not organized around the schema of an Oedipal rivalry, instead constricting a sense of impotence that had hardened into the conviction that he was a loser. That excess had become an impregnable fortress. The traumatic rear, in Lacanian sense, that seems to be outside the subject, which, when it repeats itself, destroys the subject while indicating the subject's place, according to Lacan, also referred to another catastrophe, as I said, that took place as he was reaching puberty. His mother's brother, the son of the grandmother who adored him, committed suicide. From then on, he dedicated himself through rituals to bringing the dead back to life, reinforcing his unshakable sense of worthlessness. His adolescence unfolded in the bleak atmosphere of his mother's utter silence regarding both her brother's death and that of her father when Alain was born. The second woman he made during the analysis was someone with whom he fell in love in a way that sweeted him, he said, as a triumph. The relationship had to stay secret as she was married. And it was for him a triumph because for the first time he said, she recognizes me, and the situation in principle was perfect for him. He will not get married, he will not have children, he is an original and it's perfect, but he can not speak on this relation, not at all. And then one day, the husband, discovering his wife's affair, threatened to kill himself. Alain backed off in horror, telling this woman he loved that he absolutely did not want anything to do with that. This additional allusion to suicide, an act that only earned his contempt on a conscious level, reinforced his isolation, his withdrawal to an impregnable position. His confinement in the role of a subhuman that he cynically asserted among his friends in order to steel himself against any unforeseen event. This is the introduction of the case, and I will now speak on transference. The transference took place in this generalized retreat that had marked his adolescence. He never stopped talking while demonstrating through his ceaseless stream of reasoning that he was talking to no one. As part of the treatment, of the cure, it was imperative that I think so, that no one listened to him, which paradoxically made one day my intervention possibly when I said to him, the analytical situation is ideal for you and it will never end. It would be too dangerous for you to accept that someone is listening to you. I remember I said someone living in life is listening to you. The only distinguishing characteristic of his youth, apart from an abiding terror of his maternal grandmother, who had chosen him as her reason of living, were that children were a tiresome burden on the parent who raised them out of a sense of duty. I am suddenly struck, and it was not only one day, by the word of his mother, who called him a charogne, which means carrion in French. And this word is not a common insult when he behaved badly and engaged in the usual childhood mischief. I realized he hadn't always been that withdrawn. He said, I realized, but he said that he hadn't always been that withdrawn man. He said that during his adolescence, he stopped hanging out with his friends, persuaded that he would never know how to act around girls or get into shape. This was when he grew interested in intellectual work, which made a good fit with his introversion. A previous event, however, came back to him unexpectedly one day. Ever since elementary school, he thought of the mother waiting for their children outside schools as shit stirrers or shit stirrers. I don't know how is the pronunciation. Shit stirrers. One day, to assert himself as a boy in the presence of one of the girls in his class, he stood in front of her in the schoolyard and heaped every insult he knew on her. The next day, the mother of that little girl took him aside and, he said, gave him a talking to. Looking back on it today, he thought that that mother had done the right thing, more or less. She had taken him aside, it's true, but without saying a word about it to his parents. He said, all the same, moms are shit tirers. All I wanted to do with Cécile was let her know I liked her. Ever since then, no woman can have me. Actually, when I say that this memory came back to him unexpectedly, it's not entirely true. Right after I had said that any person listening to him should exist, the set of association had started with a dream. He was showing an ink cartridge, letting the ink flow down his throat. Standing in front of him was a colleague, only slightly older than him, but who, unlike him, had a satisfactory research portfolio. The colleague was taken aback by Alain's gesture. As a result, he felt unmasked. It's bizarre to say in our times unmasked. He felt unmasked in the dream and he woke up. During the session, he said, I am completely crazy. He said he felt ashamed being taken by surprise in such a stupid situation. The family idiot, I said to myself, in reference to Sartre's book on Flaubert with the title. Pages from Lacan and Deleuze on idiocy also drifted through my head. We know from an etymological perspective that an idiot is a being that is trapped in a limited silent position, that it's theirs alone, the opposite of a singularity that can forge a relationship. But the same term also references the untranslatable singularity of a language, an idiom. With this dream, Alain D. allowed himself the freedom to discuss the idiom of his jouissance. During sex, he likes being stroked for a long time, especially around the anus, which spares him from having to adopt what he names the attitude of a dominant male. All the analysis has as aim or goal that he will make that someone recognize his style in jouissance. He said that I am not too normative psychoanalyst, and it's very important that I consider that the mode of his jouissance is unexpected and unknown at the beginning. After the dream, he went through a short but violent period of hypochondria that preoccupied him without him ever imagining that it could have anything to do with the dream or with his choice of a female analyst. He had hemorrhoids, felt exhausted, and thought he was gravely ill. I said, maybe it's your dream that tires you out so much. He listened politely to my words and rejected them just as politely. He was overwhelmed by the conviction that he was seriously ill. Other type of excess. His regular doctor, in view of the result from the analysis she had ordered, she too was a woman, said to him, I am not worried about you. He couldn't believe her either. And yet, during this period of the analysis, with the shit-stirring moms, the dream about the idiot with the ink cartridge, the hemorrhoid, a new episode in his professional life occurred, which allowed him to recognize his passive jouissance. So, and now I will begin my discussion, my explicit discussion on what is the role of the real and the trauma in repetition, and what is the importance of the reality during a cure. A fairly violent conflict broke out among several of his colleagues, but instead of staying uninvolved like he usually did, he worked out a possible resolution and was completely surprised to be warmly thanked for his determined intervention. As a result, he forgot his anxiety about being sick, surprised at leaving his usual inhibitions behind by means of an effective mediation in that conflict. In his analysis, he returned then to the volley of abuse towards the girl in his childhood, which was a real way for him to get close to girls when he was a boy. It wasn't exactly insulting a little girl, he said. It was instead insulting in the absolute, in the presence of a little girl who attracted him. It was the only means he had to assert his presence. Listening to this patient, we could easily say that what he lacked was a father forceful enough to tear him away from his imprisonment in maternal and grandmaternal jouissance, and cruelty, especially the cruelty of the mother, and who he never asked, who is my mother? Why my mother never spoke on the death of her brother, for example? This was impossible for him, and after years, it was me who asked this question. So we could say that he lacked a good father, but on what basis would we then want to impose a norm of subjectivation? Yes, then man's jouissance adhered to a passive scenario, but it wasn't the Oediper rivalry, as usually described, that got him out of it. He then talked a lot about the pencil that his father, who worked in a stationery store, have given him, thereby encouraging his talent as an illustrator. But at the same time, the intrinsic power of the dream, wheezing from the cartridge flowing down his throat, allowed him at that moment to recognize his own passivity. Up to that point, he admitted it intellectually only on condition that his dreams were not the product of an idiot's jouissance. Until then, he said he was pleased that his friend knew something about his sensuality, but this half-hearted acceptance wore thin once the dream confronted him with an idiot's jouissance. As if by coincidence, this recognition was linked to the invention in his social relation of an outlet for the jouissance that until then remained locked inside symptom of withdrawal, impotence, and contempt. So on one side, the recognizing of the passivity is a condition of, in reality, to be more active and not so in an absolute withdrawal. On the topic of the symptoms of what is known as conversion hysteria, I will compare the intervention of the reality in this case and the intervention of the impotence or the symptom in hysteria, as Julia, it was my first field of research, as Julia said before. On the topic of the symptom, on what is known as conversion hysteria, which crop up as though they were heading toward psychic conflicts, Freud spoke of, its German expression, somatisches Entgegenkommen. This is translated in English as somatic compliance and in French as complaisance somatique. I worked with a translator who, and I said it's with him, in English and in French, it's a bad translation. This is wrong, for there is no subject in this encounter, in this connection between jouissance and something in the reality. as with the relationship between the real and desire, and between the real and reality, this involves something else entirely. The way in which the outside, as if by chance, encounters a subjective act, a subjective process. I would translate, my translator would translate Freud's expression as somatic availability, because there is no personal subject. In a discussion on Lacan's concept of the real, and I emphasize that in Transference, it is not simply a matter of exposing the traumatic real, which is connected here to the way in which death and suicides, combined with being absorbed by the mother cruelty, have constructed a subject. The real that destroys the subject while making itself known through the automatic act of repetition plays an integral role in this analysis, with the repeated unbearable intrusion of suicide and violent death into the life of Alain D. There is also a certain contiguity between sexual life and the real, in this case, the partial reawakening of the patient's infantile sexuality, enabling a minimum level of interaction with women. But we should make a more precise determination than Lacan does of the relationship between the trauma of the real and the formation of objet art. Here, the dark side of the other is the coincidence between the fatal events and the mother's total silence regarding this death of her father and brother, replaced by the assertion that life is cruel, which she conveyed to that child as something obvious, and which he accepted without question. The circuit of his drive took shape in close contact with the intrusion of this real into what appears in the dream to be such an idiotic jouissance. Repetition in psychoanalysis is indeed, as stated in the seminar of April 1967 from Lacan, the act, I quote Lacan, it's not published. Repetition, said Lacan, is the act in which the subject as such is engendered, end of quote. But in reading Lacan, we never understand how the intrusion of the real produces the fall of the objet art. In other words, how Eros sometimes succeeds in interfering in Thanatos, except through the sexualization of the superego, and here of the maternal superego. And we don't understand how that object, which exceeds the signifying chains that have constituted the subject in abeyance, functions in the transference. The only formulation that Lacan gives of this is that the analysts encourage in an unknown way, I say in an unknown way, their own fall from their idealized position. I quote Lacan in seminar 11. If the transference is that which separates demand from the drive, the analyst's desire is that which brings it back. And in this way, it isolates the A, places it at the greatest possible distance from the I that he, the analyst, is called upon by the subject to embody. It is from this idealization that the analyst has to fall in order to be the support of the separating I. End of quote. The analyst falls, and so does the object. And by Lacan, most of the time, it falls as wasp. Does the object that invented a Darstellung, a figuration for itself in Alain's dream, fall? The term figuration, that is the translation of Darstellung, the term figuration is polysemous. It may refer to the fact that the objet R emerges through repetition, exceeding the signifying chain, or the fact that the objet R configuration can only figure in a dream when the subject is not so shackled to repetition. Finally, for Lacan, the fall of the object has a special relationship to the anal object and to worst. And yet, is the object in this example worst? Nothing is less certain. The object that Alain enjoys is both anal and oral, and as well as scopic, since his colleague's gaze surprises him in his jouissance. It is indeed the case that the subject first recoils from the passive jouissance that he recognizes as constituting him. The analyst could even say that this jouissance is the dreamer's last card tried. In French, la dernière cartouche, this is the last possibility before a catastrophe. His last resort when confronted by the terror of death and suicides, in the face of which he was even more radically powerless as early as his childhood than he was with women. But precisely, he invented this last resort in a dream. We note a kind of complicities in sequence between what is wrong called the outside and what is wrong called interiority. The complicity between the sexual unconscious and the outside takes two forms. It first concerns the traumatic real, so well expounded by Lacan in the case of the dream about the burning dead child in the Seminar 11. You remember, perhaps, a lit candle fell onto the bed of a dead child who, through the creation in a dream of the metaphor, who create in a dream the metaphor, I quote, "Father, can't you see I am burning?" End of quote, enables by the metaphor's very insignificance the invocation of the dream with which the father manifests the encounter forever missed with his son. The real is this forever missed encounter, said Lacan. And the small element of reality, the candle who is on the bed, what does the small element of reality mean here, according to Lacan? The expression designates the radical contingency between the day's residue, this insignificant event, and what it invokes, the unbearable real of the failed relation between father and son. that only becomes apparent when it is too late. When Lacan speaks of the small element of reality, this reality refers directly to the real through the contrast between the insignificance of the day's residue and the charge, the destructive charge of the real that it invokes. Reality intervenes differently in my patient's dream. The risky outside world captured by the dream does indeed exist in the form of that conflict between colleagues in which Alain Day was not directly involved. In his dream, he creates an erotic scenario that, when I provoke him about his view of me as dead, as far as listening to him is concerned, allows him to make a display of his inflexible but still present jouissance. The pencil also relates back to a social reality since his father worked in a stationery store. That is neither Lacan's small element of reality nor the traumatic real at work in transferal repetition. This element of past reality contributes to the creation of the erotic dream scene. It steps away from the trauma. The register of the object A, which I deliberately write in the plural form to indicate that those objects form a configuration of drives, does not merely cover the approach to the real. Eros invents a way, and all of the subsequent analysis confirmed that Alain Day wants to have a certain passivity recognized as his way, to have it recognized in particular by his analysts and by women. He claims to define himself as something other than a dominant male. Here, the outside is not just the small element of reality that directly references the destructive real, it is also the real in which an analysant finds the material that brings out the domain of the drive in abeyance. Correlatively, objects are not waste products that tear themselves away from the jouissance of the thing with a big T. They establish a certain distance, the object establishes a certain distance, an excess but not waste, in the relation to the traumatic approach of the real. This supposes that the analysant was able to take the risk of repetition without obliging the analyst to fall from an idealized position. This transformation of the pole of idealization is at work in the transference from the beginning. Instead of thinking about psychic reality as opposed to external reality, we should first specify the various modes of contingency in psychoanalysis. I would even go as far as to say the following. There is also a risk encounter between the subjective journey of an analysant and the intrusion of reality if it occurs in a way that cannot be reduced to the subjective process. In a sense, this assertion is a trivial one, as it merely corresponds to the idea that the relationships to reality improve in the analytic process if the analytic process is not hindered. But this way of presenting how reality, and not just the real, converge with subjective movement is not enough, I think. We must also understand how transference calls upon the contingency of reality and its heterogeneity is relation to desire. There is a connection and a gap between the process of desire during the transference and reality. One of the consequences, I am soon finished, one of the consequences is that psychoanalysis cannot reduce the heterogeneity of the social relation of exchange, production, transmission, and social activity to what it asserts concerning the relation of mutual exclusion between jouissance and knowledge by Lacan. Psychoanalysis' contribution to this process is fair, but it does not put an end to the heterogeneity of the social relation in relation to the journeys of desire. Social relations have a different organization or logic from that of desire, and for that very reason, they can intervene in the cure in order to modify the repetition of the trauma when the analyst's desire encourages the emergence of the real. Formulated in this way, this critical reflection on power and the limits of psychoanalysis seems to be addressed to Lacan, but it also concerns Freud. Admittedly, in the view of psychoanalysis, civilization has its discontent, but that does not mean that civilization is merely this discontentment that psychoanalysis detects. And very often, the analyst, I think, gives the impression that they give the truth on the social relation. I think it's not the case because the strange but very useful connection between reality, and transference. That does not mean that psychoanalysis says something important, does not mean that civilization is merely this discontentment that psychoanalysis detects. Similarly, civilization can be presented as various discourse, the discourse of the master, of the university, of the history, and of the analyst, all of which exclude jouissance in different ways. However, jouissance continues to circulate nonetheless, but, and it's true that the Lacanian construction on the quatre discours is interesting as construction, but this does not mean that the surplus jouissance, mehr Lust in German, is sufficient to produce the truth of what Marx attempted to identify under the name of surplus value, Mehrwert. Psychoanalysis is neither a meta-language nor a queen of sciences. Thank you a lot to listen and my talk.
Thank you so much, Monique, for such a wide-ranging and fascinating discussion. Obviously, looking forward to the one on Thursday as well. And I thank you, of course, on behalf of all our silent partners or attendees who cannot make themselves heard at this moment. So I'll take the opportunity now to welcome our respondent. So it's my pleasure to introduce our respondent for this evening's annual lecture. Darian Leader is a psychoanalyst and a founder member of the Center for Freudian Analysis and Research in London, who I've already mentioned are our kind co-sponsors for this event. He's a prolific author of a host of books that explore and elucidate some of the thorniest, most vexing and more intriguing domains of human experience opened up by psychoanalytic practice and theory. Among others, Why Do Women Write More Letters Than They Post? Promises Lovers Make When It Gets Late, Freud's Footnotes, Stealing the Mona Lisa, Why Do People Get Ill, and The New Black. The publication of his Jouissance, Sexuality, Suffering, and Satisfaction is scheduled for September. So without further ado, thank you very much, Darian, for accepting the invitation, and I'll let you respond to Monique's paper.
Thank you, Alberto, and thank you, Julia, for inviting me to be a respondent this evening. It's a great pleasure to do this, and especially since Monique David-Ménard's work has always been very important for me. One of the first books that I bought as a student when I became interested in Lacanian psychoanalysis was her book on hysteria between Freud and Lacan, which is a superb book published in 1983. I think it was translated a few years later into English. And it gives a really remarkable reading, not only of Freud's early texts on hysteria, the question of conversion, Lacan's reading of the Dora case, but it also introduces a number of Lacanian concepts, metaphor, metonymy in their relations to condensation and displacement, with clinical examples from Freud that really bring Lacan's theory to life. And that experience of reading the book is something that that I haven't forgotten, even though it was a long time ago now, in the early 1980s. And looking again at the book more recently, I felt the kind of coherence of your work in terms of the more recent publications, that in the 1983 book on hysteria, Monique is constantly questioning naive, simplistic dualisms, the mind, the body, the very simple kind of binaries that are still, common in psychoanalysis today, whether it's Lacanian psychoanalysis or non-Lacanian analysis. And in that book, she questions and unpicks very, very carefully many of those facile binaries, just as in her later work and in the more recent book on the social life of objects, she questions common distinctions that we make between the drive and representation, the signifier and jouissance, affect and the signifier, the things that we often find compared and contrasted as if they're separate polarities. Monique shows their complex interrelation and also the ways in which sometimes the oppositions are lacking a proper conceptual foundation. Now, before talking in a little bit more detail about Monique's paper this evening, just to give as a point of Freudian reference, which I think can help us to approach some of the questions that she raises. If we take as a reference Freud's paper on the infantile sexual theories of childhood, the argument is basically a very, very simple one, that there are certain human problems to do with birth, death, reproduction, and sex that are insoluble, and that children will invent, construct theories in order to make sense of them, to try and process those basic points of impossibility. When we then move from Freud to Lacan, we find that Lacan adds another two insoluble problems to that list. Not only birth, death, reproduction, and sex, but also the problems of debt and exchange. And one of the threads we find running through Monique's work is an unraveling of those motifs. I think it's particularly clear in the most recent book, where we see how these problems are at some level insoluble, and in the human encounter with that insolubility, they generate different forms of excess, different forms of problem, dilemma, and reconfiguration, which sheds light not only on social issues and problems, but also on clinical ones. Again, as I think her paper this evening shows very, very clearly. Now, if we wanted to use the paper this evening to start to open up some of those questions, which I think Monique will perhaps talk more about on Thursday, I can say that one of the classical ways in which psychoanalysis approaches problems of ownership, property, and transmission, especially within the family, is through the notions of exchange, often in Lacan circles taken from Mauss, and notions also of the gift, again, with a wide range of anthropological references. If we wanted to inflect that a little bit from the case that Monique presented this evening, where one of the central features is the problem of life and of the right to live in this patient whose history is marked by traumatic losses within the family, the mother's silence to articulate anything about them, and the grandmother's sentence on this boy that he's her reason for living, we can add to that traditional list of exchange and the gift the problem of theft. And this is something that also takes us back to the early work on symbolic functions of Russian formalism and later of 1950s and late 1940s anthropology, where in the enumeration of symbolic functions operative in culture, we find the figure of the donor, the one who gives. We have it in the story of Perseus, for example, where the objects, the magical objects that Perseus needs are stolen. We have it in the 20th century in the Asterix stories, where the magic potion he needs to get big and strong.
Oh, excuse me. It doesn't work anymore for me.
Function is to provide the magical objects to the hero in order to allow him to carry out his mission. So we see that function very clearly where we have someone who needs to carry out a mission, and then we have a donor function. What Monique's case, I think, shows very clearly is the different strands, the different logics that we find within that function. And she points out several times that the way to approach the case here is not through traditional logic. We need to go beyond of rivalry. She notes the plurality of the parents in the first dream of the patient, and that we can't see this case as an example erotic to the mother, shadowed by the consequent rivalry with the father. It doesn't make sense of the material. Rather, there's the question of the patient's relation to life, the right to live, and what life means and death as it's transmitted within the family. So we have to add then, within our Oedipal logics, we go beyond the kind of, let's say, classical, more old-fashioned ideas of the kind of typical Freudian family to a schema which involves symbolic functions, which again, anthropology can help us here, involve functions that come from outside the family, since it's not possible to combine a function of prohibition and a function of donation within the same person without generating symptomologies, without producing a lot of problems for a person, although, again, it's something that we find and we can learn about from the people we work with in analysis. Now, this obviously links to Monique's question that she poses about social excess, the link between heterogeneity in social relations and in the logic of desire, because presumably it's the same problems of possession and ownership that will characterize both Oedipal logic and social and political questions. And I think we can see a very nice example recently in what happened in Washington, Capitol Hill, where the problem of the transmission of ownership is marked by different conceptions of what we could call this Oedipal logic: theft, exchange, or gift. Yeah. So I think one of the important things that Monique's work brings out is the invitation to move beyond a kind of simplistic Oedipal view where relations in the family are based on purely emotional encounters, and rather to look at the function of symbolic and indeed social structures in that process. Again, obviously it's a development of Lacan's ideas from the mid-1950s onwards. Now, one of the other things that I found fascinating in Monique's talk is what I detect as a kind of a certain skepticism with traditional analytic drive theory. And at the end of her book on the social life of objects, she says something very, very provocative and very thought-provoking when she remarks that the drive objects localize conflict. Yeah, and if you take a moment to think about what she says, this is very, very shocking, certainly to Lacanian ears, because we tend to see the establishment of drive circuitry as not involving at all any theory of conflict. And you could say that in Lacan, there's no theory of conflict. Yeah. This is crucial. And if we then go back to Freud's paper on drives and drive changes, which Monique reads very carefully at certain points in her work, Freud himself says that the vicissitudes of the drive, its changes from active to passive, passive to active, its transformation into its opposite, reversal of content, the various vicissitudes that Freud sketched out, he thinks that those aren't automatic, but they're generated by, for example, frustrations, disappointments, and conflicts. In other words, the registration of incompatibilities and impossibilities and contradictions. Yeah. Now, that poses a number of problems, because it means that if there's a registration of contradiction, it means that there's a registration of meaning. Yeah. Which means that there has to be a difference between the drives as they operate in, let's say, the first year and a half or 2 years of life, and the drives as they're structured and operative later on. Yeah, there has to be a registration of meaning. Yeah, so it complicates drive theory. And again, Monique has helped us here as readers of Freud, because she points out, so I think it's in the recent book, or perhaps one of her other works, a mistranslation in both the French and the English version of Freud's article on drives, where Strachey, in the French translator, refer to successive waves of the drives, whereas in fact, as Monique points out, Freud uses a geological metaphor and talks about different strata of lava that set, in other words, implying a historical structuration of drives. Yeah? And that brings us back to the case and a clinical question. In the case that she's described this evening, where there's a crucial moment with the dream and the aftermath of the dream of a recognition of the patient's passivity, which is described as a drive passivity, do we see that as a kind of primary position, a kind of primary structuring of the drive, or following Freud's geological model, do we see that as an inertia perhaps that is itself the result of a conflict? Yeah. And if so, what does that mean in terms of bringing things back to the drive? I think there's a little paragraph at the end of her paper that Monique puts as an addenda, which she didn't read out, where she questions this idea of psychoanalysis bringing the analysand back to the drive. What does this mean? How can we make sense of this? And again, I detect a note of skepticism in this very commonly cited Lacanian formula. Finally, again, something that emerges very clearly from Monique's presentation of the case, the difference between the object as waste and the object as an excess present in repetition. That again, this is perhaps something directed primarily to Lacanians, where we have a kind of idealization of what we call object A. We have a lot of formulas that will repeat endlessly about object A, what happens to object A at different moments of analysis. And it's always given this status as a fallen object. Monique questions, using the clinical example, in what sense can we say that this object has fallen? And indeed, with the example of the dream and the effects of the dream, we don't see much evidence of a fallen object. And certainly we see a plurality of objects. Again, there's a sort of implicit question here. Perhaps it's not articulated as clearly as I'm suggesting, but is there a kind of a questioning of whether the concept of object A is actually really a very useful one? Might there be other formulations that can help us more in terms of trying to make sense of what kind of libidinal object is at play in the dream and in the effects of the dream? Why do we need the concept of object A in particular, rather than, I mean, without quoting any other authors, you know, the abundance of other theories of object that we find in the history of psychoanalysis? So finally, a kind of question about that status of object. You distinguish the object as waste and as excess. And perhaps Monique could say something about how that distinction might change during the process of a treatment. Is it something that one might have a kind of normative view of, as Lacan did, that there's a kind of ideal transformation, or is it something that shifts according to the particular logic, the particular unraveling in treatment? Thank you.
Thank you very much, Darian, for such an incisive and wide-ranging response. I'll ask maybe Monique to comment on your response briefly, and then we'll open up to our attendees for further questions. And just to repeat the announcement I made at the beginning, please either write your questions in the Q&A or just indicate in the Q&A still that you would like us to call on you, so to speak, and then we'll turn on your screen and then you can ask questions to Monique or indeed Darian yourselves. So Monique, please.
Thank you. Thanks a lot, Darian, to understand my work so well. And it's true that the title of my paper was Object of Desire, Object of Drives, and Jouissance in Transference. And as you can hear, I don't make really in this paper a big difference between desire and drive. This is anti-classic. I know that you asked me when I read Lacan, I said, when Lacan said back to the drive, my answer is, if the drive is not there from the beginning, he will be not there at the end. So but in Lacan, and it's very often creative and interesting, the desire has to do with the structure of the significance. What was the position of the child in the desire of the parents, and how when the analysant speaks, where are the neighbors, the important moment where significance appear decisive. That is the state of desire. And by Lacan, the only mode of articulating desire with a drive is that there is a lack in the signifying chain, and this is also a lack in the circuit of the drive, because the object, Lacan said, I said that since years, the object has the only function that the drive can turn with, due to the object, the drive can return to the own body of the people, of the person. And the object is nothing. And then in itself, the object, Lacan said, can be everything. And he is the cover of a nothing, because he is always inadequate to any satisfaction. So the only connection between drive and desire is the lack in the chain and the lack in the circuit. But since a long time, I said it's not because there is a lack in two heterogeneous phenomenon that this heterogeneity finds an end. It's not clear by Lacan. And therefore, by Lacan, this desidealization at the end of an analysis, that is not clear. The functions of objects it's true that the object falls. For example, the dream of my patient is a moment when he is no more in such a prison, and then he can make the dream, and his jouissance becomes a figuration, eine Darstellung. This is a fall, ça tombe. But tomber, here, the fall is not waste. It's a creation, on the contrary. Even if there is a big importance of the anal jouissance. The anal jouissance is not alone, is the dream. There are oral and something also with the scopic drive and so on. So this is not waste. Waste has to do with the object is nothing in itself, And I said, object is more important than Lacan said, but it's not the classical theory of drives when psychoanalysts talk on jouissance oral jouissance, and then anal jouissance, and then phallic jouissance. Lacan was right to say, no, there is a structure of desire. It's not a question of development, but the articulation of the two fields are not clear because the object is nothing itself. I said the objects in the plural, but it's true that the theory of objet A, it's very, very interesting. And objet A as cause of desire. And for example, in my example, it's true that the events of the suicide has to do with how he can be not dead. You are right. The question for this man is, can I be in life or not? Living or not? The non-experience of death was so difficult for him as a child that it's more useful to be proper dead and to construct all very intelligent phantasma and position and social position on that fact or phantasm. But what I made is to show that there is not such difference between drive and desire. And this is more Freudian than Lacanian. Freud said a human being, it's drive destinies. We are drive destinies, and it's not a biological thing. It's the sexuality in psychoanalytical sense. And on that point, I said, okay, the drive, the organization of the drives aren't something primitive and sauvage and so on. The drive is something difficult, but it's an experience who can change because it has a relation with language, another relation with language, I think, because the inadequacy of objects, that is true, inadequacy has to do with substitution and then with language. But the drive is not nothing in itself. That was my point. So, and on another point, you said it's true that I said since Éloge des hasards dans la vie sexuelle, my work is on chance, on contingency. I realize that more and more. And therefore, I said that the function of the analyst, I don't know what you will think about that, is not to be only sujet supposé savoir, supposed to know, but the analyst is a medium to make a connection between some different field of the life of the patient. One of the field is what he said. One of the field is how is his love life during this period. Another field is, for example, the moment of hypochondria, when he will nothing know on what happened. And so transference is an act, and this act connects different fields of life, and it's perhaps more important than interpretation and that than sujet supposé savoir. I will not think that an analyst is not at all sujet supposé savoir. It's true naturally that it's a part of the condition and possibility of the analysis, but never only this. I don't know what do. For example, Freud said in L'Homme au Loup that a dream is an event, something who change the person, the subject. And we know that for us, I don't know if it's the case for you too, that I consider a dream as an event, as a creation. And I try to say something on that point. It's more important than to interpret the dream. And in that sense, it's drive. It's the event in the field of drive. And it's not the contrary of language, but it has to do with what happened in this field, who is on the one side imaginary, but in another side real. And Thursday I will more speak on property, but we see today, this evening, we can hear that psychoanalysis is a practice, and she cannot be alone and without relation with what we call exterior. And naturally, the complexity of the object, the fact that the object gives a shape to a conflict, it's true. The analyst is a carrefour, a connecting medium, and the correspondence in the patient is that he is living a conflict with his symptom and so on, and express naturally the conflicts. And therefore, the sujet supposé savoir is not so the only dimension, and the object, like symptoms, localize the conflict. It's true that this question of localization has to do with the multiplicity of the dimension of subjectivity, with this paradoxical relation between what we call interior and exterior, and it's the bridge to enter into the relation to politics, because a political situation is localized. the political action has to do with a localized problem. And sometimes this localized problem, like a symptom, goes more far than the point where it begins. And I think this is the connecting point of the localization of conflict with object and the function of the analyst through for this localization, and the fact that every political situation which can change something has also a localized situation. I think that naturally it's more Foucault or Rancière than Badiou, this idea, when we compare. But it has to do also with the works of anthropologists. When I discover recently how anthropologists describe situations, I understood that there is also a question of structure, naturally. They are not just observing something, but what they construct has a site, and they are connecting multiple dimensions of the site. And therefore, in the methods, there is something very analog, an analogia between anthropology and psychoanalysis. But I will not speak too much. Thank you very much for your remarks and questions. We will continue.
Thank you, Monique. We have a question in the Q&A, which I will, from an anonymous attendee, so I will just read it out. And they ask, I wonder how Laplanche would supplement or displace this discussion, especially in the matter of the historical structuration of drives. Are we in this talk assuming that the desires are sexual, life drives, and not death drives? Where and how does the death drive seize upon and structure sexuality? Is this not one Laplanchian question that would change this discussion?
Thank you. 2 years ago, or 3 years ago now, we organized with colloquium in the International Society for Psychoanalysis and Philosophy on death drive. And we discuss a lot on that point. I think that death drive has to do with destructivity, and Laplanche, I am not sure that the criticism on death drive by Laplanche will really change what I said today, because as you see, I do agree with the sense of the sexual by Laplanche. It's true, but I have always difficulties because for me, Laplanche is one of the reader of Lacan in the years 19, or in the years 19. He criticize Lacan, but many concepts came from Lacan. I read Lacan with Leclerc, with François Perrier, with and I think that, for example, I know that many people said, and it's probably true, and for example, Judith Butler said that it's not so classical Oedipian, La Planche. It's true, but I said that I don't need La Planche. It's a historical fact. I don't need La Planche for my debate with Lacan. Lacan is one of the people for Vie et Mort en Psychanalyse, Life and Death in Psychoanalysis. It's a big, it's one of my favorites and most important readings in my training of psychoanalysis, but I don't give such an importance. It's not the reading. You say how I work, not especially with La Planche, Leclerc, François Perrier and others, but with all these, and especially I am working with the difference between Freud and Lacan. And sometimes Freud is very too classical and he has a solidarity with the patriarchal system. It's true. And even we can see this in his texts. But sometimes he is more free than Lacan. It depends of the point. And La Planche, on that point, it's possible that La Planche introduce in a better manner the historical factor in an analysis. But in relation to the question of death drive, I think we can redefine death drive without the biological language uses by Freud. Freud was a doctor in medicine, medical doctor, and I think, but this is my reading, I think that behind the pleasure principle, with the knowledge of his time, with the biological sciences of his time, he will think the relation between what is necessity in destructiveness and what can change this. And this allows me to redefine the problem of death drive. It's true that we have always a battle with destructiveness in psychoanalysis. Do we name this battle a battle with death drive or not, or destructiveness? For me, it's not the most important point, but we have to do with something we fails and repeatedly risk to fail in psychoanalysis. And that is important. For example, no, it's too recent. My patients has repeated something at the end of his analysis, and I said it's impossible. That is not the aim of an analysis to do that. And then he invented a solution. So that is death drive. But I don't need the important biological language from Freud to think what he said on death drive. I don't know if it's an answer to you. I hope so.
Thank you very much. Monique, did you want to come in on that, Darian, by any chance?
You know, I agree with what Monique says, that I don't think Laplanche is really the key thinker on that question, and that it's not really necessary to have a concept of death drive in order to try and differentiate phenomena of destruction, self-destruction, sabotage, and so on. But what Monique was just saying about this strange repetition that came back at the end of analysis, it reminded me of a lovely paper by an old Freudian analyst called Rudolf Eckstein, who was interested in exactly this problem. Why does a symptom always come back right at the end of an analysis? And he thought that it was like at the end of a theatrical performance, the actors come forward to take a bow to the audience before leaving.
Yeah, yes, it's exactly so. And yes, and we must find the good description of our intervention when it happens, even if it has something theatrical. And death drive has to do with theater. Yes.
We've got a couple of more questions in the Q&A, so I'll pose those. One from Vaibhav Saria, who says, to the constellation of terms that Monique and Darian have put forward, I would add the notion of inheritance from anthropology rather than theft. Inheritance brings to play questions of gender, Strathern and the gender of the gift, who inherits, trauma, inheritance of pain, and finally the work of time. Do you have any comments on temporality, Professor David-Ménard? That's the, so inheritance and temporality.
Thursday we will also speak from inheritance. Property has to do with identity, naturally, and we live in a society where we have the impression, we have the faith that what continue from grandfather to parents to children and so on can be changed through object of property. And for example, when Lévi-Strauss in the Savage Mind, La Pensée Sauvage, described what is at stake in a notarius, chez un notaire, when someone in a family deceased, the notaire, he make all the history of the object in order to install the fact that something continues from the dead person to the other who are there. But it's a strange creation of identity. And there are other societies where the negotiation with the death and the transmission is not so attached to such object who must be there from one generation to another. And naturally, the structure of desire have a connection with this institution. And therefore, all the problem of inheritance. For example, we will speak from the work, a small article from Marilyn Strathern in 2 days, and she shows how differently the relation between death, transmission, and rituals and object can be in other societies. And therefore, she said, property is our myth. On property object, with property object, we build not only a theory of social relation, but also a theory of the continuing of families. Is it not too much for objects? So that is a problem I will develop in 2 days.
Okay, we're sort of running out of time a little bit, so yeah. I will just take 2 questions together and let you and Darian have any final thoughts, and then we'll close what's been an extremely stimulating discussion, and obviously defer to our Thursday session as well for so many of these issues. So the first of the question is from Sammy. Thank you very much for this brilliant event. How do you think this could be expanded in the light of the Copernican revolution, Darwin, and the rereading of the seduction theory by Laplanche to take drive as something that would be, as you say, relatable to the political? And then there's a second anonymous question. How does the description of the mode of jouissance of this patient as phallic in the Lacanian sense affect the cure? So I'll let you take those however you wish.
How the last question is?
How does the description of the mode of jouissance of this patient, I imagine the patient you were discussing, as phallic in the Lacanian sense affect the cure?
I didn't speak on phallic jouissance, and it was not a hazard.
No, by chance. Yeah.
If I said to that patient, if your father will be a good father, he could extract you from this figure of cruelty of your mother and grandmother. But he doesn't have this position. He didn't have this position, the father. And we must, in psychoanalysis, work with the symptom. So I am more, that would be my answer. I am more referred to the last Lacan, the one of the symptom. What do we make with the symptom as symptom? That is to say, the invention of a singular connection between dimensions. And the phallic function has, it's true, something sometimes, not even, sometimes too normative. We are dealing with the organization of symptoms and not with an ideal of structurizing the desire. Voilà, that is my response, my non-classical response. But for other interpretation, it could be different.
Did you want to add anything, Darian?
Yeah, no, I agree with Monique's comment about the reference to the phallic jouissance, which didn't feature in the case. But just to say something about the previous question about inheritance and Monique's response, linking it to questions of desire, because it seems to me that that's another very good example of where the question of social logics and logics of desire have an encounter. When you look at the effects of depriving someone of their possessions in a situation of incarceration, like a prison or a secure psychiatric unit, beautifully studied by Goffman many, many years ago, what happens subjectively if one's deprived of all one's possessions? And what does the person then do in order to construct something in that space of privation? And that seems a very good example where these two logics come together and where we can learn something about what a psychoanalytic, what a libidinal object can be.
Mm-hmm. Yes, I do agree.
Thank you, Darren. Yes. Monique, did you want to follow up on that?
No, it's,
Okay.
I do agree with Darian. Yeah.
Great. Well, well, just take the opportunity then to thank you both for such an interesting session on behalf of the Center and indeed of our entire audience. It's been an extremely rich discussion, and we look forward to continuing it on Thursday with Alain P and not D. Shall we finish here then? And virtual applause for Monique and also for Darren for such a great session.
Okay, thank you. Thank you to you.